Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, if the state elections were a football game, we would be approaching field goal range now that the primary is less than a month away. We'll look tonight at strategies in the legislative races and what the numbers are showing in the governor's race. We'll also look at the courts dropping flags on the city's traffic camera program, as well as the rules for secrecy about judicial misconduct. Elsewhere, a special report looked deeply into the city's drainage program, and questions remain about the career of a late businessman and developer. All of this, plus a look at how a local cocktail is becoming an industry, even getting its own museum. In the mix are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Tyler Bridges, reporter of the Times-Picayune New Orleans Advocate. David Hammer, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4. And John Zimmerman, reporter, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. And there we go, John. John with the cap on. Informed Sources first, right?
Making history.
Making history here. Look, Tyler, we're going to go over to you first because there was news breaking this afternoon about a federal investigation over at New Orleans City Hall looking into permits.
Yeah, it's a story that my colleague Jeff Adelson is breaking, that quoting sources that there is a wide-ranging federal investigation into the city's building permit process, that we don't know very much information at this point, but Jeff is reporting on this, and we know that there was one indictment about a month ago.
Mm-hmm. And this is being described as widespread, and once again, I know you guys don't know a whole lot about it at this point, and Jeff is doing more reporting on it, but when we say widespread, I mean, is this beyond the safety and permits, or is it just being held within safety and permits? Or
well, we don't know, but Jeff says in his reporting from sources that it is widespread in the safety and permits office, and that it could have wide-reaching impact on the Cantrell administration, that they're expected to clean house in that department. And we know that this building inspector, Kevin Richardson, was indicted last month, specifically charged with bribing a permit analyst inside City Hall. So that's two steps there, two people involved, and now we're hearing that it could be much more far-reaching.
Okay, well, as we said, this just broke this afternoon, and so this is something I know that the paper, and I'm sure WWL will be looking into as we move farther along with it.
Yeah.
David, we're going to stick with you right now. And you guys did a really, well, you have been now for what
2 years.
2 years now.
Yeah.
A series called Down the Drain. And you all had a special half-hour program this week taking a look at where things are now with the drainage system in New Orleans. So what are we looking like?
Well, 2 years ago when we did our first hour-long special, Down the Drain, we were looking at some of the really bad abuse of power in terms of misuse of money, failure to fix the system mechanically, and especially with the pumps, the drainage pumps, and the power that runs those pumps, really major waste with tens and hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding and other funding over the years. And included in that was problems with the catch basins and drainage pipes and things like that. But there was so much focus on trying to address the emergency problems with the pumps and power failures that it seemed like not much was done to deal with the front end of the system, where the water comes down in a rainstorm and hits your catch basin and into the drainage pipes, which is controlled by the city's Department of Public Works, and it doesn't actually get into the sewage and water board system until it gets into the canals and larger culverts. So we want to take a look at that, because now we've had 3 storms, regular rainstorms, just since May, that have caused widespread flooding, and flooding in areas that hadn't been flooding before. And so, the easy answer is that you have more intense rainfall than we used to have, and climate change. That got Cedric Grant in a lot of trouble 2 years ago when he was the head of the Sewage and Water Board and Department of Public Works as a deputy mayor, and said, well, we're just a city that floods. And then we found out, no, the pumps weren't working, the power wasn't working, they had lost all these turbines. So they fixed all of that. They put a lot of money, emergency spending, into fixing those mechanisms, those mechanical parts of the system. But now there's discovery of, whole cars and 20,000 tons of debris inside these canals. And we have unknowns about the impact of things like the new Sela culverts in Uptown that is supposed to speed the water out. And we're seeing people who live right next to them who actually got damaged from the construction of these things that were supposed to make their lives better, now flooding.
They were living how many years with this going on?
Exactly,
You
5
talked
years.
To the folks on Jefferson Avenue?
Yes.
And it's just seeming like there's the real blockage there at Jefferson Avenue and Claiborne.
Yes.
Now, there are two agencies, two groups that work with drainage in the city of New Orleans. There's a Sewage and Water Board, and then there is the Public Works. And what is
Correct.
it?
Department of Public Works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that kind of a problem, or should it be working together?
Historically, they've had major problems coordinating. In fact, to such an extent that they got a combined $2 billion in funding after Katrina to fix damaged pipes and under streets and streets themselves. And they had so much trouble coordinating that it took until 2016. That's 11 years after the storm before Mayor Mitch Landrieu, then the mayor, said, oh, we finally unclogged this and we're going to figure out how to spend this money. Now, fast forward, when Cantrell took office in 2018, only 1% of that money had been spent, and now it's 5%. So it's just this tough slog just getting them to coordinate projects. And now they're saying that they're more united than they were, and they're trying to reassure people that they're really working together to try to address these problems. But there's a lot of uncertainty, even with Sewage and Water Board Director Ghassan Korban and the mayor saying that all hands are on deck and they're really trying to dive into this and fix this. There's still a lot of uncertainty about what the real problem is. Where are the clogs? Where are broken pipes? Where can things be fixed?
How about other like non-governmental changes, like the movement towards parking lots that are permeable, those sort of things? Is that going to make any difference, or is that?
They expect it to make a difference, but it's such a slow slog. Remember, with green infrastructure, they got about $500 million in federal funding for combined green infrastructure projects. Those are those like retention ponds and permeable pavement and things like that. And it's just been such a slow slog in getting that money spent. Now they're starting to bring some of those projects online, and they hope that it'll pay dividends.
So they've found that they've looked at the canals, almost all but one.
No, I mean, they're downtown.
The culverts.
Downtown, they looked at the underground culverts on Julia, Basin, Canal Street. The one that they hadn't looked at downtown yet was Canal Street. But they were saying that so far as of this week, they weren't seeing any blockages, major blockages, just in the downtown area, which is another area where you're seeing flooding that you weren't seeing before. That's separate from the large box culverts that the Corps of Engineers built uptown. That's part of the Sela project that was part of a $1 billion project. So they haven't figured that out yet. They're doing an independent study that they say that we can review and peer review and see if it's checking out. Their early indications are they don't think that it's contributing to the flooding. That's what Ghassan Korban said in an extensive interview that he did sitting down with me a couple weeks ago.
And so there's the network of smaller pipes then.
Right, that's the part that's controlled by DPW. That's the part that's 1,500, right, the city, 1,500 miles of those pipes. And they just have not been able to keep up with it. They got 72,000 catch basins, and they can only get to about 10,000 of them so far. And so they're really behind. The funding there historically has not been there. They're trying to get new sources of money through this fair share tax on tourism and hotel motel tax. And they're trying to actually, they've got some things on the ballot this fall for to sell $500 million in bonds and to move a $3 million property tax over from another thing to try to help pay for that. But that's really only the short-term stuff. They say that if we want to really do a wholesale fix of the system and make it modern, it would take billions of dollars, and that would take a drainage fee, which is something that's a whole other can of worms, but that's something that Ghassan Korban is talking about.
And in your reporting, you also compare Orleans to Jefferson Parish, and Jefferson Parish has a whole lot more personnel dealing with this.
A lot more personnel, in spite of the fact that, and it's a much newer system now, think about that.
Right.
But the size of it is almost exactly the same. It's like 1,500 miles of these pipes. It's 70,000 catch basins. They got really a lot of the same topography, but they have like 3 times as many people dedicated to this, and the head of their department says if I took this long to try to clean these systems, that would be my head.
Right. Okay.
Well, there's probably a lot of people who would like a few heads in sewage and water department as it is, right?
Well, they don't
but
want to
they've
flood.
got,
That's
you know, you
basically
do
this.
have to give them this. They are new. There's only been a year with Ghassan Korban in charge, and they are trying to make major changes. But you know, they've got to deal with civil service and
Right.
hiring and all that.
And it's a major problem. I mean, great reporting, and we can find it on your website, right?
That's right.
Okay.
WWLTV.com, special page for Down the Drain.
Okie doke. John, over to you. People might be getting some money back someday if they got a ticket from those traffic cameras from a certain time period.
Yes, the check is not in the mail. This is from a lawsuit from 2010, so that kind of shows you how long this has been going on. It was filed after the city traffic camera program began in 2008. It began under the Department of Public Works, and that was found pretty early on by the courts a couple years later to have violated the city charter. It's not a law enforcement agency. They can't issue these tickets. So that ruling was made a long time ago, but this is a case that consolidated people who paid the fine, people who got traffic scofflaws who paid the fine in the time period of January 1st, 2008 to November 4, 2010. So if you got a ticket during that time, paid that money, and that was processed through Public Works, the city has no right to that money according to this ruling, which may or may not be appealed. You imagine the city is going to appeal to the Louisiana Supreme Court, if only to kick that debt down the curve a little bit longer.
You said Department of Public Works is involved?
I'm sorry, did I say that? Yes, I did. I did indeed.
Well, given everything David has just said, it would seem hard to think that people would expect us to get this money in a very easily efficient manner,
Well,
right?
the bigger problem is not processing the payments, but the fact that the city, this is a state judgment, so the city doesn't really have to pay it. You know, there's $40 million in similar judgments that the city owes to people, you know, who may trip over a sidewalk and on up that are sitting there, and occasionally, or they get around to it years later, or they, you know, when they have to put out a bond and they want to reduce their liabilities.
Didn't Mayor Cantrell run on eliminating traffic cameras?
Yes, and this is obviously a case that predates. I mean, this is you're talking about $25.6 million plus interest over several years now, and it's been estimated at $28 million that the city would have to pay eventually, or that's the judgment anyway.
And of course, as you said, the city may appeal this, but if the payments have to be made, what's the average payment anticipated
About
to be?
a little more than $100, and you know, plus the interest that accrues. So, you know, people who paid a ticket would likely see more than $100 come back to them. When that money will come, we'll see.
When, maybe, perhaps.
But just during that 2-year period.
Just during that 2.5 years, and subsequently it went under the police department, or under, you know, a law enforcement agency. And
I'm not even sure where the city would get the money. Unless they took it from traffic cameras. I mean,
well, it might sort of point to why you know, Mayor Cantrell thought maybe differently about her campaign promise about eliminating so many of them, considering how much money comes and how
once
and
again,
this debt, which was kind of hanging over.
This could be appealed, so we'll see where this goes. Okay, Tyler, over to you. We're in a governor's race right now, and also a lot of seats in the legislature up for grabs.
Right, on the front of the governor's race, we have some clear information now, as you mentioned at the top of the show. October 12th, a little less than a month, is the primary date, and it seems clear that John Bel Edwards remains as the front runner. Polls are indicating he has about a 50-50 chance of winning the primary outright. And campaign finance reports have now come out showing that Governor Edwards and Eddie Risponi, the businessman from Baton Rouge, they both have somewhere around $6 million in cash on hand, again, about a month out. And that the polls, going back to the polls for a moment, it seems to be that Congressman Ralph Abraham from Northeast Louisiana is still in second place. Eddie Risponi is third. And under the so-called jungle primary, they are both hoping to hold John Bel Edwards under 50% on October 12th, and then it's a match between the two of them to see who would face him in the runoff. But if the governor gets above 50%, he wins outright, and that's it.
But Risponi is putting his own money into this.
Yeah,
and he's really running a lot of advertising, but he's just not cutting into that number 2 spot yet.
Yeah, Risponi is making very little of the traditional sort of retail campaign and going out and talking to people and during this campaign, and he's put over now over $11 million of his own money. The initial ads people probably have seen where he tied himself to Donald Trump. Certainly that bumped him up in the polls, but it also seemed to cause his negatives to rise a lot as well.
So even if there is a runoff, there's going to be a big gap between first and second place. I mean, because Edwards will be close to that. And the other thing is, I know the strategy is getting a runoff and hope Trump can come in. I have a hunch that even among people who really like Trump, that his coattails aren't that strong. I'm not sure if in a race like this, especially a local race on local issues, if Donald Trump can really bring that many votes with him.
Yeah, I was just reading an analysis today by an LSU professor saying that Trump has lost about 6% consistently, that the Republicans are getting about 6% less in elections than what he received in the 2016 presidential election. So that could spell a difference in favor of the governor.
Let's
Which still
quickly,
puts this.
we need to quickly touch on the legislature if we're going to get to it at all. The GOP really has its sights on even more seats in the legislature.
Right. Traditionally, talking about partisan politics in the state legislature was not something that we did, because the legislature was not partisan. Ultimately, it was either you're with the governor or you're not with the governor. But now Republicans in the House have become very partisan. They have 61 seats. They need to get to 79 more to have that supermajority, the 2/3, and they are going to come close, or they're maybe even going to get there. And that's a key question. What might happen with redistricting, which is going to be happening if they could override a governor's veto and all sorts of other legislation as well. So people should remember, not only there's a governor's election on October 12th, but for a lot of people where they live, there'll be legislative elections for both the House and the Senate as well.
But as you point out in the piece that you did last week, is that the whole GOP delegation would have to be in lockstep to.
Yeah, even if
that.
they get 70 votes, they would have to, they'd have to vote a party line. It happens in Washington. It has not traditionally happened in Louisiana, although we're moving in that direction. But traditionally, the governor has so much power that he can always pick off some members and get them on his side.
October 12th, primary, getting close. All right, thanks a lot, Tyler. Errol, over to you. Something that's really fun to talk about, and that's Sazerac cocktail.
This is pretty impressive. Some people who follow drink history say that the first American cocktail was the Sazerac, that originated in New Orleans. Other people discredit that, but it clearly was an early cocktail. And that the early cocktail was named after a cognac that was sold in New Orleans, and then they just mixed in a few things. They mixed in some bitters, and they had this drink. Over the years, it changed to rye whiskey rather than the cognac. But anyway, Sazerac has always been a classic New Orleans drink. There used to be a cafe by that name, and then the Roosevelt Hotel made it famous with the Sazerac bar. But what's happened is that there's a real there's a resurgence in cocktails across the board. But a man by the name of Bill Goldring, who's local and very industrious, but low profile, he owns the name, and he owns a company, which is called the Sazerac Company. And the Sazerac Company owns a distillery in Kentucky called Buffalo Trace. And Buffalo Trace makes a lot of different spirit liquors. I mean, you'd be surprised the things that if we go to a bar within the shelves that are actually made by a locally connected company. And then there's some other things that Buffalo Trace doesn't make that are still being made by the Sazerac Company. They claim to be the second largest purveyor of spirits in the nation. And this is a company that's really owned out of New Orleans. You never hear that much about. But what's really impressive is that they're opening this museum called the Sazerac House. So it's on Canal Street Magazine. It's very, very nice. I mean, it's one of these museums that you go in and you experience things. Now, the obvious question, can you go there and get a drink? And the answer is no. They do have some samples and some tastings, but it's not a bar. It's not a hotel. It's an interactive museum where you can really learn a lot about New Orleans history and New Orleans liquor, and it's really interesting. And some of the key ingredients to Sazerac's, one is Peychaud's bitters. Well, the Sazerac Company owns that now too. They make Peychaud's bitter. And another key ingredient was always absinthe. Well, there was a time many years ago when absinthe for a while was outlawed. And so some people came up with substitute absinthe. And one was something called herb saint, which is sort of like that anise flavored thing, okay? And so for many years, the ingredients has been Peychaud bitters and herb saint. Well, Sazerac owns herb saint also. And so essentially they own the ingredients, all right? The one ingredient that they don't own yet is sugar, okay? but it's become very impressive. I think it's going to do a lot to popularize the Sazerac. But more important, I think it's just be a major tourist stop where New Orleans, in the same way that we've claimed World War II, okay, is ours. Okay, I think we're claiming the cocktail industry as a place to experience and to learn it. And I hope locals don't say that's for tourists, because locals can go in there and really learn a lot. So it's really interesting.
It sounds like a really interesting
Yeah, it
place, and
is.
certainly a Sazerac cocktail
And I got to say,
is
this
quite
guy
a good
knows
one.
this guy knows his drink history.
Well, especially Sazerac.
Sazerac,
I
yeah.
have been on them Sazerac.
Me too. I really do enjoy them. Okay, thanks a lot, E. David, over to you. And we heard about this 2 weeks ago, the what's been described as an accidental death of
Yeah.
Roland von Kernotowski, who is a prominent businessman
Right.
and developer. What more do we know
Well,
about this?
you know, when he became maybe more prominent recently, I did a lot of reporting on this back in the spring and well, going into last year, because he owned Tipitina's, the famous jazz,
Right.
music club, and he was having trouble paying his bills. He also helped rebuild the Orpheum Theater and that opened last year again, and or a couple years ago, but he was selling all of that stuff last year because he was running into major financial problems, and he was being sued by investors and accused of running a Ponzi scheme by investors. And so I looked into it.
Including his family, right?
Yeah, it's including his family. You know, other investors really felt like they were taken for a ride on, you know, a bond fund and lied to about what the money was being used for. And he said it was tied up in his real estate. And I did some extensive interviews with him and reported that he was under federal investigation. The FBI was looking into it. And then he was on his farm in Mississippi near the Louisiana border carrier in Hancock County, and was hunting hogs, feral hogs, on his property, and he died of a gunshot wound to the heart. Now, that raised a lot of speculation about whether it was intentional or not. It was found initially by Hancock County Sheriff's Office investigators to be accidental. He was found many hours after he was shot by a family friend, and they've kind of pieced some things together, but the chief investigator told me this week that they are still waiting to get some things back from forensics. They've got an outside agency looking at it before they can make a final determination. This is important because people who have lawsuits pending against him and therefore now against his estate have to be potentially concerned about whether there's any kind of issue with insurance or the way that the money transfers over in this bond fund, because it terminates on his death, and there's various rules that apply there.
Well, he had vast real estate holdings too.
Yes,
out of
all
state as
across
well.
the South, exactly. There were, again, some things with his Tipitina's Foundation that he ran, including some of these
South Shore Harbor.
South Shore Harbor is his big, newest thing. And I went out there, and it's now finally, there have been some delays, but it's a really nice venue. It's supposed to be a music venue, an event venue, and it's coming along, but it's still got to get finished. And that's on public property, but that's owned by the Lakefront Authority.
He's really, you know, there's so many things about him that are being questioned, and so many other things that were just honorable and good work.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
Like the Orpheum Theater. I mean, that was his product, and I think even his wife and daughter went up and climbed a ladder.
Did the work themselves.
Did the gold
He had his
leafing
own-
on it, yeah.
Yeah, and he really, you know, did a lot with this Instruments That Comin'
yeah.
fundraiser, and more than 5,000 instruments to area schools to help youth learn music. So
And
he did a lot of good
musicians
things.
just generally too. He was really supportive of musicians.
But there were concerns about the fact that he was bouncing checks to a lot of musicians as well. So.
Yeah. Okay. All right, David. Thanks. John, back over to you. And you've been doing the stories about the Judiciary Commission and how if there is a complaint about a judge, we don't get to know about it at all.
Right,
It's very
right.
secretive. But Supreme Court has made a change to that.
They did make a change last week, we think in response to our series and the stories that we did on their own colleague, Justice Hughes, Jefferson Hughes, and the secrecy of the process of the Judiciary Commission's process for disciplining state judges, that they signed an order unanimously last Friday, basically saying, okay, people who complain and the judges themselves, after the case is closed, you can speak about it. Before now, that really people were told,
You couldn't talk
be
about it
quiet,
at all.
don't talk about it. They didn't say there was an end date for not talking about it. And the judges basically same thing. They were told you can't talk about it.
Can they talk about it if there is a hearing, while the hearing is
They
going
still
on?
can't
or
talk.
still-
They can talk about it if they notice a hearing that there's going to be a hearing, or when a case is closed. But that's not absolute. They can shut it down too if they feel like they don't want you to speak. So
Not only that, you analyzed it and found only 1% of the cases even get that far.
well, no, this is a little bit earlier in the process,
Okay.
but 1% of the cases, right, become public because there's a recommendation from the commission to the Supreme Court to take action against a judge. It's so rare. It's so usually happens 99% of the time in these sort of we're going to work something out where there's a private admonishment or an apology or something that nobody ever hears about and nobody has been allowed to hear about it.
Right.
So it's your impression this was a ruling or a decision after a lot of kicking and screaming?
Well, I'm not saying that. I think that they recognize that people were seeing the secrecy of the process.
And it
as
was
being-
a First Amendment issue. I mean,
right. It's different than
3
lawyers.
years. Yeah, 3 years ago, right? Lawyers had a more open process than judges if there was a complaint against them.
And still do.
And judges are elected officials. And 3 years ago, I looked at a case where a man was actually jailed by a local judge in a closed courtroom, which is a violation of the Sixth Amendment rights. And he filed a complaint. And he was told, do not tell anybody about this. And he said, this is outrageous. So I did a story about that recently as well.
But critics say this is just not far enough because any kind of records or paperwork or whatever, that still would be secret.
That's
That
right,
would not be
unless it
revealed to
gets
the
to
public.
that Supreme Court level. Nothing documenting the case has been added to what's public.
But there has been some movement. Okay, time to look ahead. E.
Well, the football season just opened, but we're only a little bit more than a month away before the opening of the NBA season. And the Pelicans open October 22nd on the road in Toronto. In the past, you say, well, Toronto, big deal. This year, Toronto is the defending NBA
Right.
champions. And so they really
Yeah,
start off at
they
the
beat my
challenge.
team.
the very, very top. The Pelicans' home opener is the 25th against Dallas.
Okay, Tyler.
Yeah, with the governor's race and elections on October 12th, the governor's race, which has been pretty quiet so far, the first debate is September 19th, so things should kick up with that.
All righty.
I wanted to tell people they could go pick up their copy of New Orleans Magazine, Errol, because my brother was honored in it. Daniel Hammer, the head of the
Wonderful.
Historic New Orleans Collection, as one of 30 to watch for this year. So I was glad to be there when Errol helped present the award to him the other day. So
One should always pick up the New Orleans magazine.
yes,
anyway, right?
absolutely.
John.
Well, it's a little ahead, but on October 7th, we all know last year Louisiana voters changed the law regarding non-unanimous juries, and the U.S. Supreme Court is taking up the issue on October 7th in a Louisiana case.
Again, thanks to your reporting.
Sure.
That's why he's allowed to wear the hat.
He'll take credit for it. All right, guys.
Gets the hat.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you guys for joining us, too. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.